Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we listen to a calm summary of a story that begins quietly and lingers deeply. The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy, first published in 1886. A tale about a seemingly successful life and the question of what truly sustains it. Ivan Ilyich is dead. That is how this story begins. For his colleagues, this news is, at first, not a cause for grief, but for calculation. They think of vacant positions, possible promotions, personal advantage. Obligatory sympathy mingles with relief at still being alive themselves. Within the family, there is no real closeness either. His wife is concerned primarily with financial matters, pensions, and entitlements. Death is unpleasant, disruptive, something to be organized as quickly as possible. But before we remain with this ending, the story leads us back. Ivan Ilyich was a man who had done everything correctly, at least according to the standards of his time. He came from respectable circumstances, studied law, built a career in government service. He was dutiful, proper, well-adjusted. His life followed a straight line without dramatic turns. He married because it was appropriate, not out of great love, but out of reason. The marriage was pleasant at first, later strained, eventually distant. Ivan avoided conflict by retreating into his work. There he found order, recognition, and clear rules. His professional advancement confirmed him. Each promotion felt like proof that he was on the right path. He furnished his apartments tastefully, associated with the proper people, and kept his distance from anything unpleasant or troublesome. Life was meant to run smoothly, without friction, without deep questions. Then something seemingly trivial happens. During a move, Ivan Ilyich injures himself awkwardly. It is only a minor accident, nothing dramatic. But from a slight pain, something persistent slowly develops. A pulling sensation, a pressure, a discomfort that does not disappear. At first, he does not take it seriously. He continues his work, ignores the warning signs. Illness does not fit into his image of order and control. But the pain remains and quietly begins to undermine his life. Ivan Ilyich still believes he has everything under control. Yet something has already begun to shift. The pain no longer leaves Ivan Ilyich. At first, it comes only occasionally, a dull ache that can be ignored, but over time it grows steadier, more insistent. It accompanies him at work, at meals, even in quiet moments. Something that once seemed natural, well-being, begins to disappear. Ivan consults doctors, several of them. Each examines him, taps, asks questions, writes prescriptions. The conversations follow a familiar pattern: complicated technical terms, cautious phrasing, evasive answers. No doctor tells him clearly what he has, but all treat him as though something is seriously wrong. This uncertainty unsettles him more than the pain itself. Ivan wants certainty, a diagnosis, a name, something that can be classified. Instead, there remains only the feeling that his life is being discussed as if it were a case, not a person. At home, the atmosphere worsens. His wife reacts irritably to his complaints. Illness disrupts routine, brings unrest into a life built on functioning properly. Conversations revolve around money, obligations, what Ivan can no longer provide. Closeness does not arise from this. Ivan begins to withdraw. He lies on the sofa, listens to the voices of others, and feels excluded at the same time. Everything around him continues as if nothing has happened. That very fact intensifies his sense of isolation. The pain becomes something independent. It determines his thoughts, his sleep, his view of the world. Joy loses significance. Conversations exhaust him. What once seemed important, status, order, social roles, now appears flat and foreign. For the first time, a question arises that he has long avoided. What if life does not simply continue? This question frightens him more than any medical uncertainty because it cannot be answered by work, reason, or social rules. It remains unanswered and accompanies him through the day. Ivan Ilyich senses that something fundamental has changed, not only his body but his relationship to life itself. The illness forces him to look, and that is precisely what he has avoided for years. He still fights against this thought, but the silence into which he falls grows deeper.
Over time, Ivan Ilyich loses connection to his former life. The days resemble one another, shaped by pain and the attempt to control it. He measures it, observes every change, every worsening. Yet the more closely he watches, the more the pain escapes his control. The nights are especially difficult. Sleep brings no restoration, only brief interruptions of suffering. Ivan lies awake, listens to the sounds of the apartment, and feels separated from all life. While others sleep, he is alone with his thoughts. These thoughts grow darker. He begins to wonder whether his life was truly as right as he had always believed. Until now, he had never allowed this question. His life had been proper, adjusted, socially recognized. That had to be enough. He had been certain of it. But now, doubt arises. What if this right life was not right at all? What if he had clung for years to something that meant nothing to him? These questions no longer leave him. They surface whenever he is alone and cannot be pushed aside. He remembers moments in which he consciously avoided closeness in order to preserve comfort. Decisions he made not out of conviction, but convenience. The pain seems to intensify these thoughts. It is not only physical, it permeates everything. Ivan feels betrayed, not only by his body, but by life itself. He had done everything expected of him. Why should it strike him now? In this inner unrest, a new figure appears differently than before. The young servant, Gerasim. He cares for Ivan without reluctance, helps him, listens to him, holds him when the pain becomes unbearable. Gerasim's manner is simple, honest, free of false pity. With him, Ivan feels understood for the first time. Gerasim speaks openly about illness and death, without evasion, without fear. For him, dying is not a scandal, but part of life. This attitude is both comforting and unsettling to Ivan. For the first time, Ivan allows himself to voice a thought he had not even permitted himself to think, that he may be dying. This thought is terrible, and at the same time liberating, for it forces him to be honest with himself, with his life, with the question of whether it was truly lived as it should have been. He still resists this realization, but his resistance grows weaker, and the truth draws closer. Ivan Ilyich begins to understand that his illness is not merely a physical condition, but a rupture in his former worldview. Everything he believed in, order, career, social recognition, loses its solidity. It no longer sustains him. The people around him continue to react evasively. His wife shows patience as long as necessary, but her closeness remains functional. She speaks of duties, burdens, what must be endured. To Ivan, it sounds hollow. He senses that for her, his suffering is above all a disruption of daily life. His colleagues also avoid the subject. When they visit, they speak of trivialities, of work, of life outside. No one articulates what hangs in the room. This silence weighs more heavily on him than the pain itself. Ivan feels increasingly alone, not because no one is there, but because no one is truly with him. Only Gerasim remains different. He holds Ivan's legs when the pain is severe, without impatience, without disgust. He listens when Ivan complains and does not contradict him. In his simple, open manner lies a calm that comforts Ivan. One day, Gerasim says, quite naturally, that we must all die someday, and that there is nothing shameful in being ill or needing help. These words strike Ivan deeply, not because they are new, but because they are honest. In contrast, his own thoughts appear increasingly contradictory. He wavers between denial and recognition, between fear and clarity. Sometimes he is convinced that everything is a mistake, that he will recover. At other times, he is overcome by certainty that there is no return. In those moments, he begins to review his life once more. Not in great events, but in small decisions, in what he avoided, in what he never spoke aloud. And he realizes that his striving for a right life distanced him from much that could have been close to him. This realization is painful. It cannot be softened, yet it is clearer than anything he has thought before. For the first time, Ivan Ilyich sees his life not from the outside, but from within. And this new perspective cannot be undone.
Ivan Ilyich's condition visibly deteriorates. The pain is now constant, leaving him almost no respite. His body grows weaker, his movements more difficult. Yet while his body yields, his thinking becomes clearer, painfully clear. Again and again he asks himself the same question: have I lived rightly? At first he tries to ward it off. He lists his achievements, his efforts, his sense of duty. He did what was expected of him. He harmed no one. But the more often he repeats these thoughts, the emptier they sound. In quiet moments, he recognizes that his life was primarily directed toward avoiding discomfort. He wanted no conflicts, no depth, no disorder. He often found closeness disruptive, emotions risky. Instead, he clung to forms, conventions, what was considered proper. This realization torments him more than the physical pain. He remembers situations in which he deliberately looked away, conversations he ended because they became uncomfortable. His family, to whom he provided material security but little genuine closeness. He realizes that his life was outwardly correct, inwardly empty. His relationship with his wife now appears especially foreign to him. He sees that there had never been true connection between them. They had lived side by side, not together. And he himself had wanted it that way because it was easier. This insight strikes him hard. For the first time, he feels true regret, not over isolated mistakes, but over an entire attitude toward life. He understands that he deprived himself of something essential. At the same time, fear of death grows. Not fear of the physical end, but fear that everything may have been in vain, that he lived without truly living. In this despair, Ivan Ilyich clings to Gerasim. His simple presence, his natural way of dealing with illness and death becomes his only support. With him, Ivan needs to explain nothing, justify nothing. Slowly, a new thought forms within him, still indistinct, still tentative, that perhaps it is not too late to understand something, even if it is too late to change something. And this thought begins to loosen something within him.
Ivan Ilyich now lies almost constantly in bed. The world outside his room has become foreign to him, distant and meaningless. Time loses its structure. Days and nights flow into one another. What remains is awareness and pain. But this pain has changed. It is no longer merely physical. It is permeated by fear, resistance, an inner struggle. Ivan senses that he is resisting something without fully knowing what. He feels as though he is in a dark tunnel, at the end of which something waits that he does not want to face. Again and again he thinks, "This cannot be. Not me. Not now. Not after such an orderly life." This resistance exhausts him more than anything else. He clings to the thought that somewhere there must be a mistake, that life cannot release him so easily. Yet the more he fights, the tighter it becomes within him. In a moment of greatest exhaustion, something breaks open. Ivan hears himself ask inwardly, very calmly, very clearly, "What if my whole life was wrong? Not wrong in a moral sense, but wrongly directed. What if he always lived outwardly and never inwardly?" This thought terrifies him deeply. Yet instead of creating new fear, it brings something else. Honesty. For the first time, Ivan allows himself no longer to justify, explain, or defend. He sees himself as he was. Not better, not worse, simply clearer. In this state, he thinks of his family, of his wife, of his son, and he recognizes that their suffering does not arise from his death, but from the distance he created while he was still alive. This realization hurts, but it is true. For the first time, Ivan feels compassion, not for himself, but for others. He understands that his dying is hard for them and that his resistance only increases their suffering. Within this compassion lies something new, something gentle, something opening. The struggle subsides, not completely, but noticeably. And with this subsiding, death itself changes. It no longer appears only as a threat, but as something that seeks to be understood. Ivan Ilyich senses that his end is near. The physical pain is still there, but it no longer fully governs him. Something else moves to the forefront, an inner process he long avoided. He hears his son weeping. This sound strikes him more deeply than anything before. For the first time, he sees not only his own suffering, but that of others. He understands that his clinging to life, his resistance to death, torments not only himself, but also those around him. In this moment, something decisive happens. Ivan lets go. Not in the sense of surrender, but in the sense of understanding. He realizes that his suffering was rooted in fear. Fear of having lived wrongly, and fear of judgment at the end. But now he understands that this judgment does not come from outside. It arises within himself. And he recognizes something even more important, that what matters is not how correct a life was, but how honest. This insight changes everything. Fear loses its sharpness. Death, which had seemed like a black void, becomes something else, a transition he no longer has to fight. Ivan feels compassion for his wife, for his son. He wishes to comfort them, to relieve them of their burden. In this wish lies a new attitude he scarcely knew in life, one not based on duty, but on compassion. In this moment, death loses its terror. What remains is light. Ivan Ilyich dies peacefully, not triumphantly, not despairing, but reconciled with himself.
And with that, our story for today comes to an end. A story about illness, honesty, and the question of whether a life was right simply because it was properly lived. Perhaps you are now wondering, how different is this calm, short version from Tolstoy's original, with all its social observations? Why does Ivan Ilyich recognize only at the end what was missing in his life? And what does this story say about denial, compassion, and the fear of a misdirected life, then as now? We explore these and other questions in our accompanying book, Golden Pages, Volume 1. There, we place the story in context, examine its background, and show why Tolstoy's narrative continues to resonate today. You will find the link in the description. For today, you may simply let the story settle. Let your thoughts slowly come to rest. And if you like, we will listen together again tomorrow. Good night.